Now it is. Thank you. It's all right. Thank you. Thank you for that comment, Rob, and thank you for giving us those other scriptural examples. Let's look specifically at the text for tonight, which is going to be the relationship between Moses and Joshua. And I want to put all three of these examples up there. So we're kind of going to look at it from three different angles, and these three different angles are kind of a timeline as well. So we're going to start with Joshua was a willing mentee, and then Moses was a willing mentor, and then ultimately how they worked together to transfer leadership between Moses and Joshua. And so we're going to start by looking from Joshua's perspective. This is kind of starting with Joshua as a younger man. And so let's go through these four. Let's go through these four passages real quick, starting in Exodus chapter 17. Whoever has that passage, let's just go ahead and read it. And then when they're done, we'll do the next one, the next one, and the next one. And then we'll kind of talk about all of them together. So let's start with Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 13. No, I don't believe so.
Okay,
That's all right.
Okay. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword.
Now, Exodus chapter 24, verses 12 through 13.
The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone, the law and the commandment which I have written for your instruction." So Moses rode with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God.
Thank you, and then we'll keep going. Exodus chapter 32. Exodus.
When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "There is a noise of war in the camp." But he said, "It is not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear."
Thank you, and then lastly, Exodus chapter 33, verse 11.
Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from his hand.
Thank you. So let's consider these four verses holistically. And the first question I want to ask is, in what ways was Joshua prepared for leadership throughout his life? So Joshua was a willing mentee. He clearly was attached to the hip with Moses, and he's learning all of these things throughout his life. In what ways was he prepared for leadership? Maybe we can just start with the text itself. What do we see Joshua doing in each of these passages? You want to go?
I think you said it in your question. He was physically close. And that might just be like the simplest. Like if you want to seek out a mentor or be around a godly person, someone you can look up to, you're not going to find that just sitting in your house trying to do your own thing, staying in your own cubicle at work. You got to get up. You got to go to those people.
Amen. I love that. That's not something I thought of, but I think that's completely applicable. In each of these instances, Joshua is physically close to Moses. Even just this last passage that we read in 33:11, Joshua the son of Nun would not depart from the tent while Moses is in the tent. So if Moses has to go away and talk to God, he's standing right there and waiting for him as well. I think that's awesome. Yeah.
Because I think that you really get more from mentoring implicitly than explicitly. Like I think about the people I've learned a lot from. More of it is from watching their examples, seeing how they handle situations. That's probably 10 times for every one time that they say, "Now listen here, Adam. Like here's
Amen. I don't, maybe y'all's fathers or parents are different than my father and my parents, but my dad is not the type of dad that's going to sit you down on his knee and explain to you all the life lessons that he wants you to know. In many ways, the lessons I learned from my dad are just from watching him and being by his side my entire childhood. And I learned the type of man he is, his morals, his character, his values, just by watching the things he's doing. So if there's a mentor in your life that you want to grow closer to, that you want to learn from, just be near that person. I find that be very helpful. You have a comment?
Kind of going off of this, it's in all of these examples, it's on the job training. He's getting, firsthand experience of the leadership and what Moses has to go through and what he's going to be taking over.
Absolutely. How did Joshua support Moses? In what ways was Joshua a helper to Moses?
In chapter 32 verses, it's like he's reporting to Moses. So he's kind of filling him in on maybe what he missed when he was away up at the top of the mountain.
Let's go back and look at that specifically. Exodus chapter 32, verses 17 and 18. Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted. He said to Moses, "There is a noise of war in the camp." But he said, "It is not the sound of shouting for victory or the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear." And this is right after the golden calf incident. So I find this really particularly interesting because Joshua is reporting to Moses at a time when it might be very easy to side against Moses, and everyone is kind of doing the wrong thing and turning away. And this is one of the first instances that we see of Joshua being countercultural and saying, "Hey, I know that everyone else is going in this direction, but I know what's right. I know what the Lord desires. I want to stick close to Moses." And so he's reporting to him in a time of sin. I find that very interesting. Any other thoughts and comments? How did Joshua show his faithfulness to God while serving Moses? We kind of just hinted on one of those topics, but we see Joshua supporting Moses as a person, but at the same time that he's being a mentee to Moses, he's also serving God in his own way. In what ways do we see Joshua being faithful in his service here? Yeah.
The most obvious thing to me is he is only one of, or a couple of his generation that was able to go into the promised land. Everybody else his age group died in the wilderness. He was faithful throughout, and he's rewarded for that. He's recognized for that.
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of steadfast to it too, that he's a younger man in some of these verses, and he's fighting against the Amalekites from a younger age, and he continues to be faithful and serve for Moses throughout his life, and he's definitely rewarded for that. All right, let's transition to the next topic. Which is Moses as a willing mentor. Here are the verses. I'll put them up there for y'all, and we'll go through them in the same way we did before. So let's start in Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. We'll start in Numbers chapter 11. We'll start with verses 27 through 30.
The young man ran and told Moses, "Tell them to meet out prophesying in the camp." And Joshua the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses from his youth, said, "My lord Moses, stop them." But Moses said to him, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his spirit on you." And Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the king.
Thank you. And then Numbers chapter 13, verses 8 and verses 16.
From the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea, the son of Nun. Verse 16. These were the names of the men whom Moses sent out to spy the land. And Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun,
Thank you. Just once again emphasizing that Joshua was within that group that spied out the land. And then Numbers chapter 27. So we'll flip ahead a little bit.
Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in. The congregation of the Lord may not be as a sheep that have no shepherd. So the Lord said to Moses, Take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Make him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation, and you shall commission him in their sight. You shall invest him with some of your authority, and all the congregation of the people of Israel may obey. And he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire from him by the judgment of the Urim before the Lord. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the people of Israel with him, the whole congregation. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua, and made him stand before Eleazar the priest and the whole congregation, and laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord directed through Moses.
Thank you. So let's look at these three, and let's look at them this time from Moses' perspective as a mentor. So we see Joshua from a young age being faithful to God, staying close to Moses and supporting him. But how do we see Moses in these three passages supporting or mentoring Joshua?
For one, he accepts his role. He's not wanting to hold this position and feel threatened by this. God's given him this direct successor, and he takes it as that.
Yeah. I love that because in specifically the verses that we just looked at in Numbers chapter 27, in verse 15, Moses spoke to the Lord saying, Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation. So he's asking God to appoint someone. And then in verse 18, so the Lord said to Moses, Take Joshua the son of Nun. So Moses asks for God to appoint someone to be after him. He doesn't necessarily say, Hey, Lord, please let it be Joshua, which I think is a cool distinction from some of the people that we see in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles who sort of take by force or establish their own dynasties. Here we see Moses putting the decision in God's hands. Joshua has clearly been prepared for this, and it wouldn't be necessarily out of the question for Moses to say, Lord, please, appoint Joshua to succeed me. But he puts it in the Lord's hands and says, Lord, appoint someone, and the Lord picks Joshua. But Moses doesn't wait for that person to be appointed before he does the work of preparing that person. And I'm sure Moses was a mentor to many people in the nation of Israel, but specifically for Joshua, the reason I picked out these three passages in particular, first thing he does is correct Joshua, which I think is really interesting. Joshua speaks up against Moses, and Moses, for one reason or another, thinks he has it wrong, and so he's not afraid to, I almost use the word rebuke. I don't know if rebuke is the right word. That might be a tad strong, but I like the word corrected, which is help Joshua understand the truth of the situation. And then a little bit later, after he teaches him correct doctrine, you could say, he trusts Joshua to spy out the land, which is why we read those passages. He trusts him with a quote-unquote leadership role, although in a smaller capacity. And Joshua, what does he do? Performs really well in that smaller leadership role to someone that is faithful in little, they'll be faithful in much. And so Moses gives him a little, and he's very faithful in that, comes back and gives a positive report in the midst of the rebellion that we read about, I think a couple classes ago. And then ultimately, God appoints him to be the next leader after Moses is asking for that. So Moses as a mentor here, I think, is taking steps that we can take personally in our own lives, which is for those younger people or those who are less experienced in the faith, don't be afraid to give correction, even when it might feel awkward when someone says something that's wrong or someone has a wrong understanding. Don't be afraid to correct them. And then for those people that are mentees in your life, don't be afraid to give them little bits of responsibility. Don't be afraid to ask things of them, to test them, to give them a little bit of responsibility to see how they do, not just as a test, but also as a teaching tool to bring that person to be a stronger leader, so that ultimately when this decision comes to appoint someone after you, in whatever context that might be, that person is fully prepared to do so. And so, talking about Moses as a mentor, what role does mentorship have in the life of a Christian? So for us specifically, what ways can we apply this to our lives? And how does Moses here mirror the mentors in his own life? So think back to our class on Moses and his father-in-law and some of the other elders of Israel. How did Moses learn from the mentors in his life? Or if you want to take it in the practical perspective, in what ways can we apply these lessons that Moses is showing to our own personal lives? Yeah, Ian.
We can teach others the truth by reading the Bible with them.
Yeah, you say reading the Bible with them? Is that what you said? Yeah, absolutely. Let me put the questions up there for us. Don't know. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Similar to Rob brought up Titus, future stranger. Titus 2, essentially it's looking at whether older Christians or physically older. We each have our roles in teaching the younger how to live. Inherently, we're mentors. Again, kind of like you were talking about with your dad, like his role of a father. He didn't have to say anything. We have an example just by the way that we live. No matter what we might say, we're automatically mentors when people are watching us.
Absolutely, yeah. Both to people in the church and to people outside the church, watching the way we act and learning from that. Yeah.
I think about how, now that I'm in my thirties, how the little girls need like good examples, and how I don't have children, but I'm still like very maternal, and it's a really beautiful thing to be able to spend time with the younger girls or look for ways to mentor their hearts and show them what it's like to serve God and be a godly woman. So I think it's a gift to be a mentor. It's so fulfilling, and it fills. I just told Ryan and Becky, it fills the voids in my heart. So I don't know, when I see this or think of this, it makes me have like a warm and fuzzies. So I think it's a beautiful thing and an awesome opportunity to share from your life experience and help others.
I think especially in the last passage, in chapter 27, it gets kind of to the nitty-gritty of what mentorship is for, and ultimately it's for replacement. And if you want there to be a good program at your job whenever you leave, or if you want there to be good kids running your family when you leave the picture, mentorship has to be a part of that. And so it's a necessity of keeping good people in charge. And I like that the transition here was, I'm trying to find the exact words, but invest in him some of your authority. And so if you have a mentor-mentee relationship and the mentor is never really willing at the end to start giving those responsibilities and giving that authority off, then I think they're missing the big point of what the mentorship is about. The mentorship is supposed to be a passing off. And so train up people who you would be so comfortable and proud to leave that heritage to.
Absolutely. Your comment made me think of a couple of things. One, it makes me think of how many congregations have younger preachers, quote unquote younger preachers, who are full-time pulpit preachers, and then they have the retired preacher in his 80s or 90s sitting in the congregation with his family, not as a preacher anymore, but still as a member of that congregation. How cool that must be to see a preacher who helped in many ways shepherd or lead a congregation for so many years, who's able to step back and let someone else give the sermons and do the teaching and sit in his older years and kind of see that work be done is really cool. Another thing it made me think of is when I was in college, I was in a fraternity. And each year we went through something called recruitment or rush, if the cool kids call it that. But one of the things they always said in recruitment was recruit yourself. Like that's what they always said, recruit yourself. So go and find someone who's just like you, that's into the things that you're into, and recruit that person. Because if everyone recruits themselves, we have another group of people coming in after us that are like us and that fulfill these roles and everything like that. So I thought that was interesting. So, and Moses, in many ways, had this awesome relationship with God and was very close with God. And then he was like, I need to teach someone to be like me, which I think is a weird thing to say in some ways, but that's kind of the point of a mentor. We choose a mentor who is someone that we want to be like. And as a mentor, you kind of want to find a mentee that you can either teach to be like you or find someone who's already like you that you can lead and take under your wing. I feel that specifically as someone who is a Catholic convert to the faith, and I see other Catholic converts to the faith, especially those that are younger than me, and I feel like I need to take those people under my wing. Why? Because they're like me, and as a mentor, it's helpful to find mentees who are like you in many ways. So I thought of that when I read these about Moses. Moses is trying to, quote unquote, recruit himself, pick a leader or train up a leader who can be like he was in that way. And hopefully, with all mentors, trying to train up someone who's going to be better. I saw a couple of hands. Was there a hand over here? Yeah. Either one. Take turns.
When you were kind of touching on this about who recruiting people like you, like when I looked at somebody who's older, it's like I want to be like you. As I get older, that is like when I identify certain men, that's what I've seen through the years. And why would I want to be like them? Typically, it was if there was a crisis situation that came up or just a problem that needed to be solved. I liked how they handled it, and it was usually with great wisdom and with experience. And they've already seen it before, and they already knew how to handle it, and it was not a big deal.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Your example that you did a minute ago about how cool would it be if there was an older retired preacher and somebody who's a younger doing the work? That's notoriously a trouble spot. And I think that's not a good sign. Like your example should be right, but it's often not. And I think about that example that you listed on the last one where Joshua saw people out there doing work and he was saying to Moses, come on, let's shut them down. This is your job. Let's do this. And Moses was like, no. I think a person needs to be conscious to intentionally step back and let somebody grow and learn and make their own mistakes. It's hard to watch somebody make mistakes, but we all have to.
Yeah. Can you expound a little bit about why you think that's a trouble spot and how we can do better there?
What did you say?
You said it's a trouble spot, the situation that I posed. Can you explain why and how we can do better? I think you were alluding to it, but.
I'm just thinking about the preacher situation that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Preachers are not normally very good at sitting and being quiet.
Fair. Is there another hand over here?
But that's the thing with Moses. Like, before you're a good leader, you have to be a good follower.
Yeah, which is part of why I brought up the Moses and his father-in-law, because we did a mentorship class where Moses was humble enough to take the advice of others, those that are older and wiser. And when Moses took too much on his plate and was, about willing to crack, Moses' father-in-law Jethro said, hey, you need to, divest some of this responsibility to the elders and the leaders of the people. And he did so, and I think it was for the better. And so I think it's really cool to see Moses, who he wasn't young by our standards at that point, but he was a younger leader who was willing to take the advice of those who were older, and then grew and then was mature enough to recognize, okay, someone needs to come after me, and was able to train up someone after him. So, yeah, you're right. Before he can be that person that hands off responsibility, he had to learn how to take responsibility. Yeah.
Thinking about mentorship in the life of a Christian, it reminds me of my first encounter with Matt Vaughn. And a lot of people know him, how wise he is for his age. It was a Devo at FC, and he brought up Titus 2, verses 7 and
Amen. We have other thoughts here? Let's move on to these passages. So the idea behind this third point is that kind of after this point, Moses knows that Joshua is going to succeed him, and then he goes through these steps to kind of transition the people from following Moses to following Joshua in the promised land. And I think the steps he takes are really informative to us. So let's read these three passages, starting with Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 1 through 3 and 7 through 8, and we'll kind of go through this list as well.
Then Moses went out and spoke these words to all of Israel. I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. And the Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord said. Oh, and 7.
Mm-hmm.
Then Moses, son of Joshua, had said to him in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their forefathers to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged.
Thank you. Now we'll read the same chapter, verses 14 through 15 and verse 23.
And the Lord said to Moses, behold, the days are approaching when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tent of meeting that I may commission him. And Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tent of meeting. And the Lord appeared in the tent in a pillar of cloud. The pillar of cloud stood over the entrance of the tent. Verse 23. And the Lord commissioned Joshua the son of Nun and said, be strong and courageous, for you shall bring the people of Israel into the land that I swore to give them. I will be with you.
Thank you. And then finally, Deuteronomy chapter 34. So a few pages over, Deuteronomy chapter 34. We'll read verses 5 through 12.
So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there was not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel.
Thank you. So we've gotten to the very end of Moses' life. And the first question I want to pose is, why was it important for Moses to participate in this leadership transition? So we see Moses handing off the battalion before he's actually passed away. And we don't see this leadership transition happen after Moses has passed away. And I think there is a lot of importance there. So why was it important for Moses himself to participate in this transition?
So that there potentially could be no conflict, no challenging to it.
Yeah, I think that's huge. How many times have we read one of the grumbling instances where the people decide they're going to appoint for themselves a new leader and go back to Egypt? So we see here, there's no dispute, no infighting over who the next leader is going to be. Someone has been prepared, and then Moses helped and publicly says, hey, this is the person. You know, God publicly says this is the person, and they were able to transition smoothly into the taking of the land. Any other thoughts on why it was important for Moses to be a part of this?
So I think I'm saying the same thing that you said.
No doubt. No. Yeah.
I also think for Moses, it shows he cares, and I'm sure it provided him great peace of mind.
Yeah, we'll talk about Moses and how he was feeling in a second, but I agree with you that it probably gave him a lot of confidence knowing that he had someone that he trusted fully who was going to be there after. I think of this verse as well as being really impactful. Deuteronomy 31, verse 8, where Moses is publicly saying to Joshua in front of all the people, "It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed." Because in many ways, it was Moses who instigated this whole thing. The people were crying out to the Lord in Egypt, and it was Moses who showed up and got things going, and the Moses who led them out, and Moses who interceded for them. And now you're into a point where you're not going to have Moses. That must be terrifying for the people. And if there was no succession plan when Moses died, you can very easily see a circumstance where the people freak out and sin and do something wrong. But when Moses says, hey, him and God, have a plan for who is coming next, and then him assuring the people that it doesn't necessarily matter if it's me or if it's Joshua, the Lord is the one who goes before you and is preparing the way for them, saying, hey, don't trust in me, I'm going to be gone. Trust in God, and he's going to continue to lead you forward, I think is a helpful reminder. So Morgan mentioned specifically Moses, and I want to ask this question because I find this really fascinating. If you were Moses, how would you feel about handing over leadership to Joshua here? Because I think in many ways you feel really confident in the future in the leadership of God's people. But in many ways you also have to feel really frustrated maybe or sad knowing that you've sinned and you can't be the one to lead people into the promised land, but you have to hand over leadership to someone else to do that job that you've been kind of preparing the people for your entire life. I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip discussion there. Maybe dwell on that because I think that's really fascinating. And the last thing I want to talk about just in our last, minute or two is this point here. Actually, I'll throw up the verse as well. I'm not sure we're going to read it. But as most of you probably know, Jesus and Joshua share the name Yeshua, which literally means the Lord is salvation. And I find that really fascinating because we call Jesus Jesus, which is perfectly acceptable in my understanding. But connecting him with the biblical character of Joshua and recognizing that they share a common name with a common meaning, I think is really impactful here because we see Joshua being the one to lead God's people into the promised land. And so I think it's really interesting that when Jesus comes and he's preparing to lead us into the promised land, as Joshua first did, we see someone named Joshua or Yeshua. And so I think there's a Christmas connection there to be made, and I'll leave you to do it on your own time. So our takeaway for tonight, Joshua was willing to learn from Moses, and Moses was willing to train Joshua. Together they facilitated a transition of leadership that helped God's people enter the promised land. We have our last class in the Lessons from Life of Moses series. Moses is now dead, and we're going to see and talk about sort of the last instances where we see Moses in the Transfiguration in the New Testament, and kind of talk about the legacy of Moses that he left in the New Testament writings as well. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you.